Welcome, everybody, to the Holistic Savage podcast, where we like to talk about all things related to functional health, including functional medicine, functional fitness, functional spirituality, functional psychology. We really want to empower and educate people so they can really be proactive in accomplishing their best life, reaching optimal health. So I am very excited to have my good friend, mold expert, Dr. Lauren Tessier, on the show with me today. Dr. Lauren, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing very good. It's this conversation's kind of been a long time coming, and we're gonna dive into one of my absolute favorite subjects with mold and biotoxin illness and Cirs and all this cool stuff. I will quickly, throw in the disclaimer to the audience. Certainly, this is for educational purposes only. Nothing in this conversation is intended for medical advice for you. Please be sure to work responsibly with your medical providers. And some of you struggling out there, by the end of the episode, you might want to be reaching out to Dr. Lauren to get some of that expert help. So with that said, as you know, we're both kind of in this little bit of a mold club that's growing. We had Sandeep on the show season 1, and that was a little bit kind of an overview intro conversation of mold, and even kind of talking more about the coaching component and the psychological component of how to work through this stuff, and what are running all of these tests going to do for you mentally as you try to work through these health complaints and struggles. But I want to take that a little bit deeper into some of the sciencey stuff, some of the sort of the complexities, because whenever I'm speaking or teaching about mold, I try to really make an initial point about, hey, guys, mold is ubiquitous. Fungi is such a crucial part of our ecosystem, such a crucial part of our microbiome. We have fungus in us and on us all the time. So we don't want to, induce any of this, fear or neurosis or orthorexic tendencies that really just don't serve us on the path to health. So I'd love to kind of kickstart by asking, in your experience, how common do you feel like mold illness really is, or how do you help people understand where, you've got some people that might get exposed asymptomatic, nothing present, and other people that, that canary in the coal mine, they get crushed. How do you speak to this?
Yeah, it's interesting because the way I have my practice set up, it's really a self-selected practice. My practice name is Life After Mold. So usually the people that I have coming into my space are people who have, been to like 5 different Lyme doctors. They've been on Lyme treatment for however many years. They've gone through the, IV antibiotics. They've gone through the Cowden protocol. They've gone through everything, you name it. And they kind of hit this point where, I have Lyme in my history, but also, I'm just realizing that we have kind of mold in the house. So, that's usually the people that end up coming to me. Some of the biggest complaints that I see from people are just unrelenting fatigue. If there was one thing that I could really just put a pin in and have people kind of step back and look at, it's the brain fog and fatigue. There's lots of other stuff that really comes with it, but like those are the ones that I find are the most problematic for people, and they tend to try to be treated by other outlets. So when you're encountering these things and they're just resistant to everything you're throwing at it, then it's really time to really step back and think about what's happening in the environment.
Absolutely. And the mold, Lyme kind of environmental acquired illness world, on the one hand, I feel like in our industry, it's super popular right now. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of, just like everything else, kind of that information overload. And I think it makes it hard for both practitioners, let alone, patients, clients, consumers, to really figure out what they need. And certainly I get a ton of people that will come to me where, they've been through practitioner after practitioner. They've spent, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on different treatment and modalities. So I'm interested to hear your take on, why is it so hard for people that are ill and struggling with biotoxin illness or chronic Lyme and mold, and some of the nuances of even finding a practitioner that can effectively help them?
Right. it's hard to navigate for people because there's so many different layers of when someone approaches a practitioner. You have the layer of what's happened in their life, what's happened in their social, emotional relationships around them, what's happening with the provider on that day. In most cases, we hope that we are a blank canvas, that we can hold space with people and reflect back and kind of give what is needed. But sometimes practitioners don't vibe with patients, or I should say the other way around. Sometimes patients don't vibe with practitioners, and that can be an added element to finding the correct help. So, you're having someone who is sick, someone who potentially has an inflamed brain, someone who might be not supported in their social circle to go and reach out help. And then maybe I or another practitioner might be someone who reminds you of that one person that like rear-ended you that one time on the highway. You don't really vibe. So you also never know like the what's just going to kind of come with the therapeutic interactions that you have. And then you load on top of it all of the other health issues that are coming with it. So it can really be really nuanced to find the help that you need. And I, for one, both as a patient in my private life, and a practitioner in my professional life, I understand what it is to not vibe. And so I always remind people. In fact, I did it today. I told someone, like they want to go back to their primary care and get some basic workup done, and they had a really nasty relationship with them previously, and I invited them to consider what it would be like to find another doctor where you have a clean footing and there's not this kind of difficult and trust interaction and that difficult dance with nuance and relationship.
Mm-hmm. You're so right. And a lot of times, whatever it is that I'm talking about, I always kind of try to draw that line in the sand of, well, okay, psychology and physiology, it's the two sides of the human form, and they can't really be separated. But just for the sake of making it easier to navigate all these different layers of kind of the healing journey, we do almost have to draw that line of there's the psychological contributors and then the physiological, because it's something we've previously discussed. If a patient or client has victim mentality and a lot of orthorexia or kind of these behavioral disorders, or they just don't jive with the practitioner, it's going to make it damn near impossible to try to navigate the nuances of the physiology. So it's definitely a tricky thing. I'm curious, how did you become really embedded into mold and the Cirs worlds and Lyme? How did this end up being your specialty?
I feel bad for so many people in the audience right now who have heard this story. I apologize in advance. I'm sure some people are rolling their eyes at it. But there's a few different ways that I've become involved. There was the kind of I could say the demonstration from the universe, and then there is the personal experience, and then there's the motivator. So, the demonstration from the universe, I came to Waterbury in 2013. We had a history of floods here from Irene in 2011. And I had some really resistant treatment some resistant fatigue, some resistant like rashes and brain fog that really weren't responding to normal naturopathic things, and kind of just sat back with some of the history and really thought about the concept of what is happening water damage wise or environmental. And at that point, mold is anything and any education that you go through, mold is a quick glance. I will tell you that. So, I was kind of like, oh, maybe I should ask about mold, and come to find out, a couple of these different patients essentially had horrible influx of water damage in their home, in their basement. And, that's what really started the push forward on the mold path. That's what really lifted the veil. And then since then, I've had my own personal experiences with mold exposure that have been very interesting to say the least. Everything from living in a moldy environment for unfortunately 5 years to moving into a new home and essentially remediating ourselves successfully, I might add, which was a really interesting and cool experience. And then there's the personal motivator. So when I was a kid, I had this one uncle that I loved and I adored. And he was loud and fun, and it just totally resonated with him. And as he got older, he moved into a different apartment, and it was unfortunately a walkout basement apartment. And he developed an autoimmune disease while he was in there, also known as Wegener's granulomatosis. It took the hospital, I believe, quite a few weeks to diagnose it. And while he was in the hospital, we did the family thing. We went in, we organized his things, we kind of made his home a home to come back to. And during that process, there was the realization that, oh, there's a lot of mold here. And that was something that my mother had mentioned to me. It kind of stayed in the back of my head. And he got better, felt a little bit better, returned to the moldy space. And about a year later, he had succumbed to his autoimmunity while still living in that same basement apartment. So there was always something there of autoimmunity, mold equals loss of my uncle. Very deeply ingrained in my heart from a really young age. And just kind of as the time has progressed, I've done a good amount of research with mold and have made autoimmunity connections, or the possibility of, hey, this could be something. So I think about, my uncle a lot, and there's definitely that concept of, if I can prevent someone else from suffering such a loss, I would love to be able to do that. So that's really one of the things that keeps me motivated in my heart of hearts in this process.
Yeah, beautiful. I appreciate you sharing that. And I don't know that I've ever met anybody that, became involved in kind of the functional healing, holistic health world without going through their own crisis or a loved one. And certainly having started my career as a trainer and nutritionist, I never would have imagined that, mold would be such a focal point of my career. But hey, I had my experiences, and it kind of propels us on that path. And nothing more kind of altruistic and beautiful than, turning around and using that in service to others. But, so with mold, I know that you get them. I know I've gotten them a lot, and it breaks my heart where there's so many people who will be struggling from all these mysterious symptoms, mysterious health complaints. I've been there. A lot of us listening and involved in the subject we do our due diligence. We're responsible. We're proactive. We go to our primary care physician. Oh, your blood work looks normal. We can't find anything wrong with you. Maybe it's all in your head. Do you want to take something to make you feel better? Like, that is unfortunately the typical narrative. And so something I want to open up, and before we go too far down the rabbit hole, I'm certainly not at all here to ever speak ill of conventional medicine. They're amazing at certain things, but there's a lot of gaps to the model. I think we can all agree upon that. And so it's a little interesting because whereas the agricultural industry, they level mycotoxins in food, and they're aware of monitoring levels. There's the established toxicology levels, or, there's even stuff that they can add to animal feed to, mitigate the mycotoxins in the GI tract in cows and pigs and stuff. Okay, so we have that. And then, big pharma is smart enough of, hey, we can use these mold secondary metabolites as statin drugs. We can use mycophenolic acid as an immunosuppressant. But then when it comes to, detecting maybe fungal imbalances or fungal infections, or then, the toxicity being a totally separate thing, it feels like it's sort of blatantly ignored. I'd love to kind of get your take on that, being a naturopathic physician.
Yeah. The mold is far and wide. It's everywhere. It exists in all realms. There's some really beautiful things that come out of our fungal ecology. We have a lot of wonderful gifts from the world when it comes to mushrooms that degrade petroleum and all of these really cool beneficial things. Like breads and alcohols and wines and all of these great things. But we do have that kind of balance. So I invite into this dialogue too the fact that just like functional medicine, just like naturopathy, just like good bacteria, bad bacteria, there's always two sides to a coin. There's always two different kind of push and pulls, and there is a concern with why conventional medicine doesn't pay too much mind to it, but I'll also say there's a concern in naturopathic medicine about, why I'm doing and receiving all of this education and sharing all of this education with people however many years after I've completed my formal training. There's definitely some element in all of healthcare that we're only really just starting to turn an eye back to mold and fungi. And the question really is why. And I think as practitioners, we need to be responsible in this dialogue because we represent one another and we also represent our clients and our patients. So what I can say and what I can focus on are the facts. Like, yes, we use secondary metabolites, mycotoxins as different types of medications for sure. Life-saving, frankly, we also use a lot of antifungals in our agricultural industry. And why aren't we paying attention to certain things in the human population? And I think a lot of it comes back to the way we have set up our practice of science. For people who might not be familiar with how studies are run, there's an institutional review board, which is a group of people that kind of sit and look at the setup for each one of these studies to make sure that it's ethical, to make sure you're not holding a 4-year-old child hostage and exposing them to ochratoxin egg. So there's something to be said about the ethicalness of whatever you're studying. And in that case, in our whole entire field, we center around this concept of a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, meaning that whoever is participating in the intervention, they can't tell what they're being given. Same thing for whoever's researching. So everyone's blind to whatever they're studying, and then the outcome happens at the end, and they crunch the numbers and figure everything out and adjust the results as needed. So anyway, long story short, we have this concept of science where it's not an ethical thing to put a human in a box and pump in ochratoxin, but it's totally okay to do that to an animal. So we have this world where what's the word that I want to, a specific word I want to use there, but the value of our information is happening in a way that we can't do with mold. So, there's a lot of people are saying, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? And you say, well, first of all, the evidence is it's danger in and of itself. We can't show you that particular evidence because it's dangerous. And secondly, we do have some evidence, and it's in animal studies, or in the case of humans, it's in something called a longitudinal study, which looks at a group of people who may have had an unintentional exposure in the past. So these two types of studies, they don't seem to fulfill the desire for knowledge. And so, for a typical conventional doctor who's pressed for time, and doesn't have the opportunity to go into the literature and sit down and read all of the animal studies and put 2 and 2 together, they're just going to blow it off as nothing. And it's sad and it's unfortunate, but that's part of the reason why I do my monthly writing for MDNR. I crank out, research synthesis, 2,500 word essays about autoimmunity, brain health, these things from mold and mycotoxins, really coming from the data that I can get hold of, stuff that's frankly available in PubMed. So, I don't know why people are so resistant to it. I think it's just a matter of convenience and a matter of just the way the system is set up to just close it off and just
Hmm.
make it not available. I'm so myopic with my focus on mold, but there's got to be other pieces of research that suffer that same fate, you know?
There absolutely is, and something. I'm just a kind of a young dude having a lot of fun these days with my career, and it's fun for me to because I don't have a background in naturopathic medicine I have a background in bro science, and so it's fun because I can kind of make these just observations and see what's going on.
Hmm.
And it definitely, I won't go into that tangent, but a lot of times kind of conventional alternative functional, it almost feels a lot like a political conversation of kind of, you got the super conservative Republican versus the radical left, and they kind of keep each other in balance to some degree. You don't want the teeter totter kind of leaning too far either way.
Yes.
Sometimes in the functional medicine space, it can feel very down the rabbit hole, very theoretical, very sensationalized, maybe not really clinically validated or researched yet. And it's
Hmm.
like, well, I mean, sure, we need to blaze new trails. We need to always be asking those questions, digging deeper. And then I'm kind of starting, well, I saw a commercial for a pharmaceutical grade omega-3 supplement or a pharmaceutical grade curcumin. So it's kind of like, once something gets validated enough, conventional kind of cherry picks and of like, oh yeah, we knew that the whole time. That's our standard of treatment. It's just way after,
Right.
the
Right.
common things first. So there is a lot of layers to that dynamic, which then makes it so hard for the patient trying to find the help they need to get it.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree 110% for sure. And I think that, there is something to be said though. Every now and then you'll see these two sides. Like, for example, you said, in political, for example, like liberal and conservative, there's always a melding. There's always some group of people, whether it's functional medicine, naturopathic medicine, there's always some type of middle path that really, I think, needs to be honored and held up as probably the best course of action, really.
Hmm. Hmm. So then, in the world of mold and biotoxin illness, we hear this term Cirs get thrown around a lot, and I see it more and more, and now MCAS, kind of feels like the diagnosis of the month to some degree. So it's like, okay, this Cirs, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, that I think was coined by Dr. Richie
Mhm.
Schumacher. I don't know how he pronounces his last name. And I know that you're Shoemaker certified, and he was, a pioneering uh, figure in this world. Um, but I'm seeing a ton now. A4M and all these organizations are jumping on kind of the Cirs train, so to speak. So I'd love to hear you, being a Cirs certified physician and all that, kind of speak to what is Cirs, and these are generally thought of as kind of those canaries in the coal mine, the worst of the worst. They're the ones that are just not getting better, which is really what you specialize
Sure. So I think before we go there, I want people to understand this concept of mold illness.
in.
And if you think back to our Venn diagram in our childhood and, how it was beaten to us in school, we have our two overlapping circles. And now if we took that and we flipped it and we had four overlapping circles, that is how I ask people to envision mold illness. And each one of those main circles is a type of way that mold illness can interact with us. And then in between those circles is a way that it can kind of manifest and what it looks like. So in each one of those circles, if we were to label them, one would be mold fungal allergy, which is something widely accepted by the medical community. The next one would be fungal infection, something more accepted by the medical community. And the bottom two would be Cirs and mycotoxicosis. And so, depending on how someone presents, they can have a bit of a mycotoxic picture, as a result of a fungal infection that they have. They could have some mycotoxicosis that, after you clear it out, continues on as Cirs. They could be someone that has a lot of the typical allergenic triad, so asthma, um, eczema and in general allergies, and they could have a toxic component as well too. So, I remind practitioners that people don't show up just as one. People show up as this like hodgepodge of like a twisted up ball of yarn. And it's up for you to ask the clinical questions and provide the correct testing so you can suss out which path is the one that you're likely to follow or to look into. So, Cirs for me, it's the last thing. It's really the last thing. When I started out doing shoemakers work, it was the case of rollout. You have someone come in. They're coming to me for this. We do C3A, C4A, TGF-beta1, the alphabet soup of these tests. And what I started seeing in these folks was that they weren't meeting case definition of Cirs. And so the difficulty with Cirs is that the true definition of what it is like a moving target. It's a moving target like autoimmunity. So something like, let's say, lupus. Lupus has a criteria where you got to meet like 3 out of the 5 or something, and then have these 2 clinical symptoms or something like that. So there's kind of a constantly moving, my lupus might look different from your lupus, might look different from their lupus. Similar thing with Cirs. Cirs has a very a fluxing case definition where we have this list of systems and we ask people these questions to see how many symptom clusters they fall into. And then based off of that, we then go do testing and how many abnormal testing parameters do they fall into. So someone's Cirs could look a lot different from yours, could look a lot different from mine, but what I've seen in a lot of these patients is the first step of Cirs is to get people out of exposure and to put them on a binder. Well, guess what? That's the first step to mycotoxicosis too. So I have this way that I work with people in that we pinky swear that we're going to work on exposure outside of my therapeutic interaction with them. And as they're kind of getting things in order and going, and we can kind of double back and talk more about that later, we start kind of working towards detoxing them. Now, there's a whole process that you do prior to detoxing someone, because you just can't go in and like detox people. That's just, it's asking for trouble, especially in a lot of these really sensitive folks. So after some time of detoxing people, maybe like 6 months after they're out of exposure, you sit back and you go, okay, how are you feeling? And some of them recover really quickly, and that's great. I tell them, get out of here, you're good, I'm here if you need me, Godspeed. But it's after we remove that toxic exposure that people still continue to kind of feel cruddy. We then kind of move on to the questioning of Cirs, or we then move on to the question of, well, maybe the mycotoxins aren't in their environment. Maybe they're in their body. So maybe they're a result of a colonization or an infection. So Cirs is always kind of the worst case scenario for me. And, you can assign someone Cirs and then they go through treatment and it turns out they were just a mycotoxicosis. So the question is, what do you call that then? We are in a position, physicians especially, who can assign diagnosis codes. It is an ethical dilemma to sign someone's chart with Cirs. And this is something I'm going to be talking about at the AAMP conference, Paul Anderson's conference in the fall in Seattle. And Cirs doesn't actually exist. Cirs does not have an ICD-10 code. So here we are. We're having really sick people come in. We're treating them. And we're assigning them with a diagnosis code that actually belongs to a totally different disease state. We're assigning them a diagnosis code of R65.10, which is Cirs, S-I-R-S. And this is high temperature, high heart rate, high respiratory rate, and elevated blood cells. So it's either high or low, actually, on all of those, more or less. And when you look at a typical Cirs person, Cirs, I'm saying it with quotations for people, they don't meet that criteria. So there's the ethical dilemma of we're putting on this super bill, on this piece of paper, a diagnosis code for something completely else. And it's like, well, what about people's life insurance? Mm-hmm. What about, the future ethical considerations of how this diagnosis code is going to follow them around? So when it comes to using Cirs, I'm super cautious about it. And I don't mean to discredit any of the work that Shoemaker is doing, because I do believe that a chronic inflammatory response syndrome exists. And, I think that we really need to be raising up the discussion of this to higher powers that are in charge of these ICD-10 codes. Are you familiar with Jenna Luther? I think it's LUCHE-THYER.
I don't know that I am.
Okay. I encourage everyone who's listening right now, if you want to have your mind blown, and I mean like absolutely blown, go look up her name. She spoke at ILADS in 2017. I'm hoping that you guys could even like hyperlink to this video.
Sure.
She is someone who does tons of humanitarian efforts. She works with child trafficking or against child trafficking, female circumcision, all of these crimes against humanity. And one of the things that she actually fought for representation in ICD-11, so the next set of diagnosis codes, is neural Lyme. So she essentially went before, I believe it was the WHO. I'm sorry about not knowing off the top of my head, guys. She went before them and said, hey, lack of representation is a crime against humanity. Like, these people are spending their life, inheritance or work, whatever they have, any type of last bit of money on a treatment for something that's very real in their body, but doesn't exist in these all-knowing books of codes. And therefore, they're not receiving appropriate care. They're not receiving timely care. They're not being represented appropriately. And so there's this thing where once you get a diagnosis code, it really represents the ability for the medical paradigm to pay attention and to adopt it, which kind of goes back to being able to open up the dialogue about research trials and all of these, like, it finally exists. So, I've sent her an email and kind of pinged her and been like, hey, mold.
Yeah.
And just trying to hopefully open up a dialogue with her at some point, because I think that representation for these issues are really big and really important. And, the truth of the matter is there's no diagnosis code for Cirs. There's no diagnosis code for mycotoxicosis. There's not. There's accidental aflatoxin exposure by food. And once again, that goes back to the food and the agricultural industry. And you can't code people with those, if you think it's due to an environment. So, Cirs, I don't think it's as widespread as it is claimed to be by 25% of the population, only because the work that I do with people that's really working to address mycotoxicosis and infection or colonization, very, very, very few people beyond that get into that Cirs realm.
I love all this. I love what you're saying with, opening up to kind of the broader ethical and, working with healthcare and advancing the diagnostic criteria and whatnot, because, so many people in the functional space and holistic alternative, paying a lot of out of pocket and just bleeding, all of their money. And so certainly with, mold, I think about just all the different layers of, okay, there's sure some dietary exposure possibly, or the more severe, sick building syndrome kind of stuff. And it makes me think back, like, what was that, St. Anthony's fire with the ergot poisoning and everything. You look through history of like, well, I mean, we've co-evolved with mold forever. And as you alluded to, where there's that beautiful documentary, Fantastic Fungi, that, talks all about the beautiful side of fungi and mushrooms from a, systems biology perspective. And of course, too, I can't help but think of some of the evolutionary adaptation to it of, viruses have really shaped our protein adaptation, or kind of what sort of hormetic effect we might have with resilience to mycotoxins. And, it's all very fascinating. But then, of course, like using myself as an example, I previously was in a relationship. I was living in a home with her and her three children, and we didn't know at the time that there was a lot of mold and whatnot, although bathroom flooded, so that might have been a little bit of a clue. But it was very interesting. I was just personal trainer and nutrition coach, and we were trying to navigate because it was so distinct. There was one day in particular, she woke up and was just completely just locked up, musculoskeletal pain,
Mm-hmm.
ice pick pain. And that was literally just the beginning of like the worst phase of my life, where she was that one that just bedridden, and
Mm-hmm.
only getting out of bed to take care of her three children. And I'm frantically trying to play mad scientist to help us navigate the situation. We went to the conventional doctor. That's what got me hooked on methylation. We couldn't afford to meet with a naturopathic physician, chiropractic, you name it. And it was interesting how, looking back, it wasn't really until I got connected to you and Dr. Deep that I was like, oh my god, then everything started clicking. Because whereas with her, kind of the crippling and more the severe symptoms, or her son, a lot of sinusitis, brain
Mm-hmm.
fog, allergy symptoms. For me, manifesting more as kind of the depressive and fatigue. And so, you mentioned the 25%, kind of alluding to like the genetic side of it, which my point being, like, from an evolutionary perspective, I could see how, that HLA polymorphism uh, helped because, oh, canary in the coal mine keels over.
Right.
This is not a safe environment. So I am curious though, because these days there is this explosion in obsession with genetics. And
Mm.
I certainly feel that there's much more that we don't know than what we do know.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Um, and even like you buy a 23andMe from Walmart, and 23andMe software asks you, do you want to know what your genes are? Because if you have higher predisposition Alzheimer's, do you want to know? And
Right.
so you literally have to select that. But there's the risk of false positives or false negatives with some testing. But anyways, the question I want to ask with the genetics, there are those that like, oh my gosh, I have the dreaded HLA, I'm
Mm-hmm.
screwed, which of course just induces this fear, this neurosis.
Right.
I'm curious from your perspective, how valuable do you feel like the genetic component is, especially when it's like, well, just because you have the gene, or yeah, I mean, how valuable do you think that is for this?
For Cirs in particular, I have mixed emotions. Well, I shouldn't say emotions. I have seen clinically mixed relevance for the HLAs. Um, in particular, I have seen Cirs cases, that don't really meet the case definition. So essentially, kind of low-level Cirs that have the really bad dreaded gene, and then I've seen people with the dreaded gene who have no signs of Cirs for their case definition. They're more of a mycotoxic person. So it's really hard to hang our hat on. And what we've seen from genetics recently, is that just because you have some type of heterozygous or homozygous mutation doesn't mean that the gene is completely defunct. Sure, there are certain inheritable diseases that typically end in death because of some type of inherited genetic anomaly. That does happen. But some of the things that people get really worked up and concerned about, they're just not things that are a death sentence, And when you're looking at something like the HLA, yeah, I think people also need to be reminded what this is. Your HLA are code for the little baseball mitts on the outside of your white blood cells that catch the antigen hold on to it and show it to the rest of the immune system and say, hey, go after this. In Cirs, the concept is that that baseball mitt is now really greasy and it can't really get a grip on the antigens that are coming in. So instead of catching that ball and showing it to the rest of the immune system to clear it out, it drops out of the mitt where it just kind of rolls around on the floor. And then another ball comes and another ball comes and another ball comes. And, all of a sudden you're burdened with toxins. So the concept of Cirs is really working from an antigen removal perspective. And, like I said, I don't see it as often. And that could be just me and the population and the people that I work with. But what I do see though is abnormal detox pathways, and genetics do code for that. Mm-hmm. People will have abnormal phase 1, phase 2, even phase 3 detox that can really affect their clinical outcomes. So I do get excited when people already have their 23andMe data pulled from years ago on a PDF on their computer, that they can upload somewhere else now that we have all these. There was a period of time where we were just at a loss for any of the translational programs. It was like maybe a year or so. It was a little bit of a dearth. But now it seems like there's a lot more people who are coming in who have done this. They've used companies like Self-Decode and things like that to really get that information tangible. And once again, it's genetics. So there's a concept of nature and nurture. It's good to know where weaknesses lie, but in those cases, they're really just weaknesses for people that can really be supported or further exacerbated, depending on what you're doing for the person.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's fun. And, I think as long as a lot of it too is kind of how people, choose to consume and then perceive this information. Is it in a, fear-inducing way? Is it in an empowering way? And I think it's kind of up to each individual to create that for themselves because, we can identify these genetic predispositions or kind of enzymatic weaknesses. And we don't fully understand how the body might be compensating for this in a lot of unique biochemical ways. So we certainly can't get too petri dish reductionistic or whatnot. But then, of course, too, like you said, sometimes it might not really be relevant, or that's where it's the amount of exposure, the resiliency, to the degree of exposure. Is there the colonization? And so, definitely, I think an important point I heard you say was, okay, step one, and everybody says it, above all else, of getting out of the exposure. And I'm curious do you feel, because I think about it a lot, certainly living in a severely water damaged building or building where there is, visible, measurable mold growth is going to be kind of more worst case scenario. I'm curious though, how much you feel like dietary exposure. I can't help but, consider it with grains, for example, being probably the more contaminated or mycotoxin contaminated. And, these spores and the toxins, it can't really be cooked or processed out very easily. And, how grain heavy the American diet is. I'm curious your thoughts on how much the dietary exposure plays into some of this.
Yeah. Before we jump into that, can I double back to one thing that you said that I think is really profound that kind of popped into my head?
Absolutely.
I think that, there's a concept of nature and nurture. We all kind of, at some point, come from, the one hominid or something like that, and we've all kind of trickled down into our branches through the years, our families, our ethnicities, all those types of things. When we sit and we look at a piece of paper and it says, well, this SNP right here is mutated, and that could be a problem. The first thing is that not all mutations are problematic. For some people, they're protective. The second thing is that it's not a report card. It's not a report card. This is you. This is your genetic identity. There is no perfect person to compare these things to. There is not one person out there who has, when you're looking at these SNP report cards, let's say they grade them usually by color of green, yellow, and red. There's no perfect divine person that is going to score all green. Like, that's just not the reality. And so, I think for people to step back, and this is a little bit more esoteric and maybe a little bit more heady than what people are after, but it's the concept of honoring yourself, honoring where you're coming from, and supporting yourself, not trying to correct yourself, not trying to pigeonhole yourself, not trying to morph yourself into something that you physically can't be, but maybe to potentially support yourself. So just kind of wanted to center back to that before we hop on, because I think a lot of people come in and they're just like, I'm wrong. And you're like, no, you're so right. You're here, you're with us. Like, we can support you, but you don't. I think so many people get caught up in the fact, I think this is just humanity in general, chasing the perfect, chasing, what they're so inclined to be, and the best. And there's the best of yourself, but you're never going to be the best and the most, perfect. You're only going to be the best version of yourself. So just kind of, I hope that brings some peace to some people who are listening right now. I don't know.
I couldn't agree more. I'm glad you made a point of that. And the majority of my podcasts are very esoteric and heady, but that's so important. And I think especially these days, like, obviously everybody's kind of familiar with this concept of American culture. We're chasing the perfect physique, the perfect life, the perfect, fence in our front yard. But I think that is part of what I worry about a little bit with the holistic health movement. Is there is kind of this idea of, well, no, you're not at optimal health, and like basically you're a loser. And there is kind of this shaming of, look, now don't get me wrong, 1 in 2 of the American population is pre-diabetic. So yes, I do think as a nation we need to up our health game by a lot. However, we don't want that to turn into like metabolic shaming where, well, no, you're not optimal health. And it's like, well, what is optimal health? How do we measure optimal health? How do you know? So I love that point. I'm glad you made it.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to hear that. It's always just so interesting when you get to really, I can talk to people about mycotoxins all day. I can talk about mold all day. But when people actually get the opportunity to step back, maybe out of their role as a provider, or even out of their role as a patient, I think that can be so insanely powerful. Some people might think about the concept of stepping out of yourself as dissociative, or that's not my goal, but it's amazing how getting that objectivity and just taking the moment to kind of look at the dialogue, look what's happening, how much that can transform health, well-being, and then even in like really acute cases of mold exposure. But anyway, so the food. So getting back to the food statement, we do have a good amount of mycotoxins in our food system. In fact, we have on certain foods, we have some of the lowest standards compared to third world countries for some of our mycotoxins. Anyone who wants to dig more into this can pull up the CAST book, CAST. Right now, off the top of my head, I'm forgetting what it stands for, but there's just such a plethora of information in there if you really want to dive into mycotoxins in food. It's a great publication. It's worthwhile. I think it might even be downloadable for free. So, how I navigate that with people, it's really dependent on the phenotype of the person. I tend to think about diet as a don't change it for now. There's always a dialogue with people where I'm like, yes, but we will get to it. Because when people come to me, they can barely sit up in bed. Like, I'm even surprised they've gotten into the office. And I'm going to ask them to like change their diet. It's one of those things like, do you have enough spoons? Are you familiar with spoonies and the concept of spoons?
No.
No. So in the chronic illness community, and spoons are just the metaphor that's given, you have 13 spoons for the day. Could be anything. Could be 13 coins. Could be whatever you want. 13 spoons. Each one of the things you do throughout a day requires a spoon. So getting out of bed and showering, that's 1 spoon. Feeding your children, that's another spoon. Towards the end of the day, you're either faced with the decision with 1 spoon left, Am I going to go and make a meal by hand, or am I going to spend that spoon sitting with my child and reading a bedtime story and interacting with them? Or am I going to spend that spoon going and getting fresh air and being in my body and sitting quietly and attentively? So it's something that's really important for people when it comes to diet. Is if you don't have the bandwidth, that's another way to put it, it's just going to be detrimental for me to assign something at the moment. So diet usually comes later. And the reason why is I consider the American diet an X variable, meaning that we know we have this amount that's the legal allowable limit in food. It's not going to be any higher, hopefully, but it will be lower. So if someone goes about eating their diet, same day to day, over time, I more or less assume that that is a constant variable. I know I'm making a large presumption that what is going in isn't being stored or, isn't bioaccumulating, but I leave that as if we don't play with diet and they don't change their diet too much, we know that that intake is going to be more or less the same from day to day. Mm-hmm. And so it's only later on that we really mess with diet. And when we do start playing around with diet, I tend to go keto for people, unless there are people who are of a smaller stature. They tend to be people that are, Ayurvedic medicine wise. They tend to be the Pitta Vata, they're really fast, they're really airy, small metabolism. Like, I'm not going to put someone who doesn't have weight to lose on a keto diet, a low carb diet. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to be able to physically feel like they're grounded and rooted in their body. But you have someone like me who's like Pitta Kapha. I could fast for like days on end, no problem. And in those instances, keto diet can be really helpful, and for numerous reasons too. Like you're avoiding grain, so that's that right off the bat. And then that high fat component of the keto diet really works to stimulate our gallbladder. It allows for a lipid exchange in our tissues, circulating in, circulating out. These are things that I know you're all aware of, Brendan. And the other thing is it also can help with hormonal imbalance. It can help address MMP9 for folks. So there's a lot of reasons why I put people on the keto diet. The two major downfalls of the keto diet, well, three, is potentially detoxing too fast. The keto flu in the beginning for people. And the third is you're eating usually animal protein that has some type of bioaccumulation. And mycotoxins. Mycotoxins get stored in fat, usually. So there's a little bit of a dance there, too. Almost everyone I see on urine mycotoxin testing comes back with elevated ochre toxins. Yeah. And I just kind of say, oh, geez, yep, that's pretty familiar. And for most people, I tend to use real-time laboratories. Mm-hmm. Most people are usually run there at like 1.5 to 3. It's usually some of the other mycotoxins on that test that I correlate a little bit more with the indoor environment and indoor environment exposure. So, there's something to be had or something to be said about the reality that mycotoxins are going to be present on most people's tests. In fact, it is a rarity that I see people who have, a negative mycotoxin test. It happens, but it's usually people who have already been undergoing treatment with me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you are mentioning all this in the 13 spoons. I've never heard that metaphor, but I definitely, when I'm consulting people, I'm very deliberate of explaining to them, like, look, you only have so much time and so much energy in the day, and we've got to focus on, the big hitters or the big kahuna, whatever it is, to, just make sure that we're being intentional and kind of getting the most bang for our buck, right? Getting the most benefit for our effort, because we can't, overhaul every detail of your life overnight. So you get those people that they're hyper focused on using one of their spoons to turn off their Wi-Fi router, but it's like, yeah, but you didn't take your binders. So I think we're flip flopped here. And then I love what we're saying with so then urine testing, which seems to be a pretty popular tool. I do worry about that. I think sometimes it feels like the holistic space, it's as a space, not pointing any fingers, it just sometimes feels like it's really good at creating problems, but does it always solve them? And so I like what you're saying with, because I was participating in a project recently, and a lot of urinary mycotoxin testing going on, and of course people start freaking out of, Brendan, oh my gosh, like, am I going to die? There's elevations in this gliotoxin in this, and they're trying to pronounce it and stuff. And so it's like, okay, right, but these are toxins that you are peeing out of your body.
Right.
So I am curious, since we're on that note, how you feel about mycotoxin testing as a clinical tool. I would imagine, that fluctuation in excretion, and how you think that can be used as part of a more sophisticated, treatment plan.
Right. So as time is marching on, I'm really trying to figure out how to express to other providers what I've really learned in all of this. And something that I keep coming back to is when I left school, I can't remember what provider it was, but it was in my clinical rotations. They said, "What is the benefit of running that test?" I'm like, "Well, you'll know what food allergies they have." Like, of course, like, duh, And they're like, "Right, but what is the benefit?" And you're like, "I have other things to do. I gotta go." And I think a lot of us get really, I call it the booger in the tissue metaphor.
Yeah.
This is so nasty.
Yes.
I'm sorry, but
no, I love it.
Most people in America, you blow your nose, and sometimes you just pick out the tissue to make sure you don't, maybe it's not bloody, or maybe, I don't know, it's just human reaction, right? So what is the benefit of doing a test? Like, yeah, you just blew your nose. Guess what? There's going to be something in the tissue, more than likely. Like, it's a similar thing with a test. So you really need to understand, like, sure, the test is going to give you information, but how are you going to use that information? How is that going to be a benefit? And so something that I've really been trying to distill down for physicians and other practitioners is know the question that the test is asking. Know the question the test is. It's like, sounds so stupid and so forward, but there's so many people, especially, neophytes in this world who, and I've been, guilty of it in the beginning too, where you just go, mold. Okay, I'm going to shoot every mold test at this and see what sticks. And the reality is, like, well, how is that going to be of benefit? And so urine mycotoxin testing, it's never something that should be used as a one-off. It just never is. It is something that needs to be used as a set point in the data. And if it's used as a one-off, you've just opened up this realm. It is not a permanent thing. It is not like a genetic test that will tell you a yes or no, this is ever present in this person. It's saying at this snapshot in time, this is where this was. So with urine mycotoxin testing, and I use the ELISA methodology because they are looking, because of the methodology, there is potential for some wiggle room to examine the fact that these are metabolic products of the breakdown of the mycotoxin. I have reached out to Great Plains Labs on 3 occasions. I have the email history, specifically requesting what type of analyte that they were using in the lab study. So when they say the metabolite of ochratoxin A, I want to know what they're looking for in their urine. They have a beautiful specificity. They use liquid chromatography. And, these things that are getting into our pee have gone through phase 1 detox, phase 2 detox, and now they're in the urine. So they're going to have some type of physical change then. They're going to have gone through all the modifications in the CYPs, and then they go through glucuronidation and all this stuff. So they're going to have a different signal on liquid chromatography. And my question was, are you looking for aflatoxin that's gone through glucuronidation or something? that has that added change to its chemical structure. And I never got an email back. So maybe they can reach out to me now that I'm saying this and let me know. So because I've never had that confirmation and the specific name of what they're testing, I've supported real-time labs simply because they use an ELISA methodology. And they use, one second. The ELISA methodology uses antibodies. And the type of antibodies they use are non-monoclonal, which means that they're a little bit more forgiving in kind of what they reach out and give a hug to. And so when you have these toxins that are going through phase 1, phase 2 detox, they're going to change structure, just like I just said. And an antibody is going to be more likely, especially if it's not monoclonal, to embrace something that might look a little different than be so specific as compared to liquid chromatography. So I find that when I use real-time labs, I'm casting a wider net. And I'm truly looking for the thing that has left the body. That's why I use real-time labs. So my clinical question when I run a real-time lab assay is, what is leaving the body at this moment in time? And we say, okay, so if that's leaving that body, we know that that was in there at some level and that it's leaving. And so we work on the person, we work on supporting detox. 3 months later, we retest. And what we should see typically, I usually give people like 6 months to a year, is kind of this inverse U-shape, inverse parabola of, it's like a roller coaster because it's what's leaving the body. Starts low, leaves more, leaves more, leaves more. And at some point, you've drained the reservoir that's in the body. And so what's going to come out is even less and less and less until you infinitely approach zero, like whatever, you know. So usually in that case, the real-time lab mycotoxin test I find to be very helpful as numerous data set points over our time in which we're detoxing people. With that being said, there can, different mycotoxins I've seen with people can be detoxed at different rates. There is the potential for maybe one to detox faster than the other, depending on their detox genetics and what's happening with whatever CYP enzymes that they have, that the mycotoxin is being processed. And, you know, I find that to be really helpful. So when people say real, you know, mycotoxin testing sucks, and I'm like, yeah, well, what are you asking? What are you looking for? What is the piece of information? And there's tons of other mold testing that you can do. You know, you can look at serology, you can look at IgM, IgG, IgE, IgA. Each one of those is going to tell you something about where it is in the body, how the body's interacting with it. You know, and there's just so much there. You could do antigen testing to see if little pieces of the mold cell wall is kicking around in the body. You can do PCR testing for a few of them. And so it's just really, what are you using to validate the clinical picture? Because you will have people come to you and they'll say, I know I'm exposed to mold. I know I feel worse in mold. And that right there should be like the thing. That right there of how people feel when they're out of it and how people feel when they're improved should really be the important aspect of the diagnosis of it. But until we have, you know, a microbe that only interacts with a human in one way, and we have one test that is 100% sensitive and specific that can really unite those two things, we're stuck with working with what we have to answer the questions that we have.
I love what you're saying with, you know, what's the question, right, that the test is answering and whatnot. And, you know, I always like to preach about, you know, the lab data is only as meaningful as well as the practitioner can extrapolate, you know, meaningful information. And, you know, there is a lot of kind of, you know, people take the lab at face value or trying to treat the piece of paper and like, well, it doesn't really work that way. And so I love hearing this because I think that's so important of really understanding the technology. What exactly is that measuring? How does that really relate back to the client or the patient? And using it to confirm or validate the clinical picture, not using it to, you know, validate like confirmation bias. You know, it's a totally different thing.
And I think the people that get caught up, I'm sorry to cut you
Oh,
off,
you're
I just
good. You're
wanted to
good.
throw this out here. I got off a conference call once because I heard someone say that everyone knows urine mycotoxin tests are trash. And I was like, I gotta go. I didn't have the space to fight about something that someone already had made a decision about. The reality, it's a piece of information. That's all it is. It's neither good nor bad. And if you're looking to diagnose Cirs from a mycotoxin test, it ain't going to happen.
Hmm.
It's not going to happen because that's not the clinical question it's answering. And so I think when people think mold, they go, Cirs, biotoxin illness. And you're like, whoa, think back to the Venn diagrams and the 4 overlaying circles and think about how this person is presenting and what test can help you really dig further and look and think about that. So,
Hmm. Absolutely. So, changing gears a little bit to the environmental side of it, because this keeps me up at night, and I always find it interesting. Movies have changed so much in the past 10 years, and I notice these things of kind of what the media is feeding us versus kind of mainstream media versus more artistic, creative media with shows and movies. And I'm seeing more movies and shows and stuff. Kind of, I was just watching a movie last night, actually, kind of sprinkling in glimpses of moldy buildings. And
mm-hmm.
I can't help but wonder if this is like a subliminal strategy to kind of like remind people of like, hey, if you see water damage, like you might want to do something. Um, in our last conversation, you said something really interesting that's almost like haunted me a little bit because
Uh-oh,
you know,
sorry.
in a good way, but I've got this like bleeding heart syndrome or something, and so the CDC is kind of getting a little bit more hot on Lyme and reporting all these new cases and whatnot, but we're not really seeing this with mold or mold illness or mycotoxicosis. You mentioned the diagnostic criteria and whatnot. Um, and you mentioned how many government buildings are flat roofed, right? Or how many government buildings might be water damaged or moldy, and kind of what that might mean. And I think that's kind of an important element because what kind of breaks my heart is thinking about all the impoverished, not just Americans, but around the world. But speaking at least as an American, how many people are impoverished, living in a crappy old, musty apartment that's been water damaged many a times before. They don't have the money to do this or that. What's your take on what these people can really do to help themselves when exposure avoidance is really step one?
Right. That's a heavy weighted conversation.
It is.
And, it's true. The reality is that, according to NIOSH, potentially 50% of the buildings in the United States have either current or past history of water damage. Um, that the best thing that you can really tell people is get out or change something. I think a lot of people get really excited about um, perfection. Again,
Mhm.
we'll say it. Of I'm going to move out of my moldy home and I am going to find the perfect home. The reality is there's mold or mold spores everywhere. It doesn't mean that it's growing in a carpet in a building, and when I say carpet, I mean like a colony. It doesn't mean that it could just have come in on the wind or something like that. So, if you do testing for living environments, you'll always find something, unless it's a hermetically sealed, completely sterile. But even then, that's questionable with all the hospitals, and that's been happening in Children's Hospital in Seattle. And so, what I'm getting at here is it's the change, it's the shift that you're looking for. Because let's say the building that I would currently be sick in might have tons of Stachybotrys and might have tons of Aspergillus niger. But then I can go to my mom's home or someone else's home that I feel a little bit better in. Yeah, they have a little bit of water damage, but maybe they have more cladosporium. And maybe cladosporium is a little bit more allergenic for me rather than more toxic and brain foggy for me. So my goal with people isn't to get perfection, but to get a different environment, a different kind of all-together fingerprint of ecology in a different space, because just that little reprieve of being somewhere else can really make a huge difference and allow your body to get caught up to itself to detox. And for people who are like, I don't know anyone, I can't do anything, I can't leave, I'm physically stuck in my home. You know, there are air purifiers and air filters. That's a really big conversation to kind of break out and tease apart. But something as simple as and this is going into masks, and I know masks are a really charged topic right now. So please, outside of the pathos of the current climate of where we're existing, the dialogue of masks and the complex chronic illness community has always been there. It's been ever present. It's not contingent on the current state of affairs. Mm-hmm. So there are particular masks that have a carbon insert that can act as an adsorbing, so sticking to an adsorbing agent. So you might not be taking yourself out of the situation, but you're blocking the mechanism of entry into the body. So you're creating a little hermetic seal, or even to the point of maybe not a perfect seal, but you're at least lessening the exposure and the saturation. Is there transdermal exposure to mycotoxins? Sure, absolutely. You know, could you worry about mucosa and all that? Sure, you could. But, you know, there can be something really profound about someone, you know, wearing a mask when they're in their home for a third of the day, and then they're receiving that much third less exposure as possible. There's also the potential of opening up windows and allowing for cross breeze and ventilation. You know, some people can even go so far as like renting or borrowing an ozone machine, or getting a cheap one on Amazon for $100 and trying to at least do some type of, you can't be in the home when you run an ozone machine, people, but potentially doing some type of treatment and then doing some type of a fan trying to exhaust it out. You know, the issue is if there's mold in there, you're not going to get better. However, you can always do small things to work towards the process of getting out. I know firsthand of what it's like to live in a situation that you really have difficulties leaving, and you're kind of stuck in a moldy situation. Like, I know what that is, you know. So in those instances, I tell people, like, you're not necessarily going to recover. The best that we can do is really work on bailing out the boat so it stays afloat. You know, when you're really going to be able to get the boat fully righted and take off on the wind is when you get out of that particular exposure.
Wonderful. I think, you know, and it is a heavy subject, but I think this is valuable dialogue to have. And even during kind of current times, I've been having friends that are in a moldy home, and they're sending me their test results like, Brendan, they're getting worse. It's like, well, I don't think being cooped up in your moldy home this whole time is helping a whole lot. So definitely important dialogue. And I love what you're saying again about not getting too caught up on chasing perfection, but just different. Give your body a break. Give your body a different stimulus. You know, it's little things that can add up over time.
Move to a different bedroom, or close the bedroom that you're in and tape it up and sleep on the couch. Or, you know, I've had people do everything. You know, I've even had people change with their spouses and their partners who don't seem to have, you know, an allergy or, you know, a sensitivity or something, just to get into a better space in the home for that many more hours of the day. You know, there are things that you can do to chip away at the exposure, and that's really the key. And the crappiest part right now is we're all home. We're all stuck home. So we actually see there's two things that are coming to fruition here as people are staying home and they're working from home, and they're potentially realizing their exposure at home is a big deal now that they're there 24 hours a day. And then you have people who have been in school or have been in work, and now they're home and they're the most productive they've ever been because their home's their safe space. So even if you're stuck in an unsafe home or it's water damage, like, potentially like go to a cafe and sit and work there and like anything to just change it and shift it. Air purifiers are a potential use. Air filters are of potential use, but you also hit your max with those where at some point, you need to keep up with the filters. They might be blowing stuff back into the air. They're not the solution for like mold growing in physically in your environment.
I was actually like right before everything kind of went down earlier this year. I was in Dallas at this. It was a joint conference, kind of like dental meets environmental.
Yeah.
Jill
that was on my list. I didn't make it.
Yeah, I was gonna say that was kind of a cool one. It was an interesting mixture. In our booth, we were in this conference hall, and it was so just musty smelling. And I'm not one of these people that's super. I've been super chronically ill, and I'm so sensitive, and I walk into a room and feel. I'm not one of those people, but literally 10 minutes of sitting at that booth in that musty area, and I was just. The irony of it, of course. So we got out of there in a hurry, but we were literally like rotating. Like, all right, you're gonna sit there for a few minutes. I'll be out here again.
Oh my gosh! No, it's legit. It's legit. I tell people, when you come to me, you're not getting someone who's just done the study and whatever, and that's glutathione in this. Like, I have physically experienced what it is like to not know what goes into my purse because I can't think. I've experienced not being able to count how many gallons of paint we need for the inside house because I've been in a home that has exposure and I have to sit outside and every time I have exposure, I have to come home and I have to shower. In fact, I had an exposure last night. Like, I get it. If you're sensitive to it, you'll always be sensitive, but it's amazing when you've recovered enough, you can go, oh, I'm getting that headache. You know what? Let's get home. I'll shower. I'll do a couple of things to help kind of stop that inflammation cascade, and I'll feel better. And the recovery, and once you know your body and your responses, how quick you can just, like, I'm here talking to you, not foggy, enjoying myself, interacting well, versus if that were something that people I would have been in contact with day to day, this would be one of the harder conversations to have. So recovery is possible, and your weakness actually really becomes the strength of the canary in the coal mine. So long as you listen to yourself and you learn to get out when you start feeling a little off. But the recovery is much quicker. But yeah, sitting in conferences, like, that's one of the harder things. As a provider, is you go and you're like, oh no, to the point that I always stay in Airbnbs.
Yeah.
I don't do hotels. I just can't, and I won't.
Yeah. I won't say exactly, but the event that you mentioned earlier, I was there last year, and there was this hallway that connected like the hotel to the conference center. And it literally, there was plastic taped down over a section of the carpet, and I literally was like sprinting through that hallway, like not breathing because it was so awful just to walk through. I'm like, I can't do this. I have to go talk about the biochemistry of this stuff, and in 30 minutes I can't be breathing this right now. Right. But it's crazy how fast it can be. But you made a very important point of listening to your body and getting in sync and in tune with that, which is something that I'm so passionate about with teaching people. Of like, hey, yes, you will need doctors throughout your life for this and that, but like nobody can teach you how to listen to your body. They can. Well, I mean, they can teach you how to be a little bit more in tune, and I think. Lab testing and all these different things can kind of act as training wheels so we can learn how to, balance and be in tune and recognize these things. But yeah, it's listening to that biofeedback and nurturing your body appropriately.
Yeah, and you see that a lot. I think some of the saddest, most upsetting things is when patients have been gaslit by providers not to listen. And that's typical. You have someone coming in with mold exposure to their primary care. They're like, oh, I have brain fog and, I have this rash and I can't focus and I can't sleep. And they're like antidepressant. So sure, while they don't know how to like take care of these things, by working that, they're also, gaslighting someone essentially into saying like, it's not what you think it is. Sorry, moving on. And I don't know. It just, it makes me so angry.
Yeah.
It makes me so, because it's part of everyone's story. Yeah. Almost everyone's story who I see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, good thing we have people like you doing the work, though. So that leads me, as we start wrapping up, I'd love to hear, your ideal patient that you want to work with, that you love to work with, and what kind of people you do like to take on for your practice, because you do telemedicine and you can work with people all over the place.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in warmth and humor. I really like people who are ready to change, or at least willing to listen, learn, and one part trust the process and equal parts be empowered in doing so. So I never ask people to follow me blindly in what I do when I work with them. I always ask for people's feedback, how they resonate with things. So there's equal parts. I think the hard part, and I can be honest with this, I don't do well with combative folks. That's just my energy. I'm not the most, I don't like confrontation. It's not my jam. And so I really tend to attract a lot of gentle, kind, motivated people who are really ready to make the change for themselves. And I always try to reflect that to people. There are people who are like, oh, thank you so much for your help. I'm like, you're the one who did it. Like, I'm just kind of put down the guide rails and scooched you along. So really the people who have that kind of softness, ready to learn, and who have also been, I think there's something to be said about being humbled by your illness. I think people who have hit that point, I tend to work really, really, really well with. I'm not the type of person who does really well with the prove this to me, prove it why. And I can sit and tell you and go through those, but you really want to spend your 2 hours of your intake of me citing PubMed and doing all that when we could really be getting good work done. So like I said, it's not a matter of following me blindly. And if people do want to learn from me, they're welcome to do any of my writing or read any of my writing on NDNR and all that kind of stuff. It's out there. Just, do a quick Google search. But yeah, and I really enjoy working with women, and I enjoy working with children too. Children are fun, really fun to work with. So.
Yeah. Well, it's wonderful. It's great. So certainly, I do have a lot of mold people that kind of are paying attention to me these days. So if any of you guys are, at your wit's end, you're struggling, because there's definitely, with the rise of the functional health professional, which is something I'm really passionate about. But we also have to make sure we keep in mind there's a big difference between functional health coaching and functional medical treatment. And so certainly, I know I get a ton of people that they'll come to me and like, sure, I can educate you all day. I can run a lot of tests. I can empower you. I can't write you that prescription. I can't treat you for this or that. And that's where we have these specialists like yourself that can come in and, I send my problematic cases your way. So to any of you listening, if you feel like this episode resonates and, you're struggling to get well, you've done a lot of the other things, Lauren very well might be that person to get your life back. Because, as your handle says, that you can have a life after mold, right?
Absolutely. And, like I said, I'm not going to be everyone's cup of tea. And I am so comfortable with honoring that. I am vice president of a nonprofit called ICI. So ISEAI, the International Society for Environmentally Acquired Illness. And we work to train all practitioners, actually, FDNs included, to learn how to treat environmental medicine. So We do have a conference that is coming up, and if you guys really want to kind of learn and ignite your passion on this, I encourage people to check out ICI. And if there's other kind of educational components, so that if you want to learn that, you can go to ICI. Additionally, we have a listing of providers and practitioners there too. So if you don't jive with me, there's plenty of other people out there who I'm sure are absolutely willing to work with you, and I really hope that people find the match that they need. So ICI will be having a conference in the fall, and additionally, I believe I'll be speaking at that one, and then the AAMP conference with Dr. Paul Anderson, which should be happening in Seattle, but I think also has the ability to go virtual. I will be doing, I believe, 5 presentations on that, everything from pediatrics to ethical issues with mold diagnosis to fatigue and all these different cool things. And the president of ICI, Mary Ackerley, will also be there giving lectures. And of course, the wonderful Paul Anderson. If you don't know anything about him, guys, definitely check him out. He's been a wonderful, near and dear mentor to me. So.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, AMP was awesome last year. I loved being at that event. And ICI, though, was literally easily one of my favorite conferences out of the like 25 that I did last year. So I can't wait for round 2 this year, this fall.
Yeah, we're hoping it'll be good. It'll be good. It'll be great.
It'll be good.
Curious time. Curious time. Yeah, so if people also want to go ahead and find me, those are the organizations I'm affiliated with, but my practice, Life After Mold, I have an Instagram handle, I have a YouTube, I have Twitter. What else do I have? I have Facebook, I have a website, and I also have a free e-booklet called Mold Prevention 101 available at my website, which kind of walks you through how to go through your house and see what things you might need to, keep your eye on as the years pass. Should you consider a French drain? Is that dehumidifier going to be helpful? What about active ventilation? That kind of thing. So that can be really helpful for people. And once again, that's at lifeaftermold.com. If you dig around on the website, you'll be able to find it.
Absolutely. We'll be sure to include those links in the description of the episode and whatnot. So be sure to check that out, because just free information help people navigate this stuff and try to prevent it, try to avoid it, try to get their life back. So Lauren, my friend, I'm so glad we finally did this. This was an amazing conversation. And although it's not looking like we'll cross paths in person anytime soon, I'm glad that we can stay connected through the internet. And so grateful for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much, Brendan. It means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep doing your work, and we'll keep lifting the world up, So I hope you have a beautiful rest of the day with your family and your baby, and maybe do some pottery.
There you go.
Don't work too hard, while you're looking out for everybody else.
I will. You too.
All right. Have a beautiful day. We'll talk soon.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.